something that was going to be a good introduction to cults for people who may not know them, but also one that may not have been heard of. And so the resources that we use for this, other than a few newspaper articles and a few news sources from the early 2000s, a book simply titled The Ugandan Cult Tragedy, a private investigation by Bernard Atuhaire. Now, this book, for fair warning for the Illuminati people who like to read along in the quote unquote book club, this thing is a dry ass read. It is literally presented like just an investigation in the facts that were found and the interviews that were there. There's no sugar. There's no storyizing this thing. It is a boring fucking read, but it's interesting in that this cult is so rarely known and there's only a single book about it. So if you want to check it out again, it's called The Uganda Cult Tragedy, a private investigation by Bernard Atuhaire. So our story begins with the eventual leader of this group by a man by the name of Joseph Kibwetere. And much like the cult he would form, and unlike many of the cult leaders from more well-known cults like the aforementioned Jonestown, very little is known of the life and supposed death of Joseph. But here's what we do know. While we don't know what year he was born, we do know he grew up in Uganda in likely the 40s and the 50s. That time in Uganda was especially politically and, more importantly for the story, religiously volatile, specifically within the Roman Catholic Church over there, of which Joseph was raised as. During this time in Uganda, movements of Catholics were preaching and emphasizing the works of miracles that were happening in their lands and multiple Marian apparitions. Do either of you know what a Marian apparition is? It's pretty self-explanatory.
Virgin Mary, right?
Yes.
It's got to be exactly what we were talking about with the alien cum episode.
Sorry, can you refresh my memory?
Exactly what we were talking about.
Yeah. It was like the lady of whatever, Fatima,
yes.
and there was like thousands of witnesses, and it's just
Sorry,
like this
man. My brain
crazy...
just went to the cum that landed on people's faces and the webby stuff that was around there.
It was like after that. It was like, it's not, we don't know. We don't know what it was. The jury's out. Right.
Well,
hi kids listening.
Listen, Marian apparitions more specifically are sightings of the Virgin Mary, but there's a specific criteria they have to fall under in order for it to count as a Marian apparition. Usually it has to be physical somewhere within the world. Dreams, visions, future sights do not count. And it also cannot be a naturally occurring structure that can be interpreted as a Marian apparition. So a rock that looks like Mary does not count as a Marian apparition. Also, interestingly, bleeding statues, which is a typical kind of miracle that happens a lot in the Catholic Church, supposedly is also not considered a Marian apparition, the Mary statues that cry tears of blood. And if you hear her voice, that also doesn't count as a Marian apparition. That's something separate called interior locution.
It's got to be It
has to be visual and it has to be in front. And that's going to matter.
Like when the Gorillaz played at the MTV Movie Awards.
Yes. I've never
It was
seen
the best holograms I've ever seen. That's
all right. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And as Joseph grew older, he would eventually run for office in Uganda in 1980 and donated enough of his own land, which is a large way that wealth is measured in Uganda at that time, so that a Catholic school could be built where he would be co-founder. Now, I tried to do some research as to how much or how old you have to be to run for office in Uganda. So I could try and piece together like his minimum age at that time. Because again, we don't have a specific date, but all I could find was much like in the US, you have to be 35 to run for they call it stand for president over in Uganda. But he wasn't running for president. He was running for another political office. And I'm not sure if the age restrictions were the same there. But my guess is he was probably in his 30s at this point in time. The Catholic school that would be built and founded by him, we know he apparently also taught at, and it was an Orthodox Catholic school. And Joseph himself had an overall positive image and reputation within his small community. While certainly very religious, for all intents and purposes, from what we know prior to 1984, he was a good man. But in 1984, Joseph claimed he started having multiple sightings of the Virgin Mary, true Marian apparitions. We don't know really what most of them were, where they were, only that he started to have these things throughout his life.
Normally, is this something that there's accounts of from the time, or is this something that he said later?
This is their accounts from at the time, and all of this is going to build essentially to the formation of the cult, which we're kind of walking toward here. We don't know, like I said, we don't know really what they were, where they were for the most part. Now, normally I imagine this would send up a lot of red flags, but this was still at a very religious time in Uganda. And you have to keep in mind, this was not I want to say rare, but it wasn't uncommon for these kinds of sightings to be happening around this time. This was a big fervor of Roman Catholic Church kind of preaching miracles and sightings often. But this was, like I said, it was just at a religious time and not as uncommon as the US. And in 1989, 5 years after his visions began, his life would take its first steps toward its darker future when he met his undoubtable number two that would essentially lead the cult, a woman by the name of Credonia Merwende. All good cult leaders need a number two, a partner, a co-founder, and Joseph would find that in Credonia. Or should I say, Credonia found that in Joseph. Unlike Joseph, we know a little bit more about Credonia as